DC in Herzliya. Michal lives here, of course, in Ra'anana, with her husband and 4 children. On a personal note, I'm very proud to be able to call Michal my friend, and again, very grateful for everything you do. So to get to our conversation, you've been spending a lot of time analyzing and speaking about anti-Semitism, in particular in its latest form, which we're seeing quite vehemently, the anti-Zionism. Rabbi, I believe the idea of calling anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism a mutating virus originated with Rabbi Sachs, and I know you've talked about that. And you've been developing this idea further and defining with organizations and legal bodies what is going on, and understanding the quick rise in anti-Semitism we are seeing today, especially on campuses. And we will get to some of that. However, tonight, I would like to focus our conversation on some of the more hopeful signs and trends that have emerged from this very difficult period. I'll just say, there's also, Michal has been interviewed recently by Daniel Bordis, and there are plenty of ways to hear, if you don't feel to get a full enough picture of what's going on with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, I can direct you to more speeches that Michal's given. So, to focus on the more hopeful note tonight, I want to ask you about Zionism after October 7th, which is the subject of our talk. Recently, I saw Elon Levy talk to a group of young Jews who are Gen Z and refer to them as Gen Zionism. And we're seeing some very interesting trends. Hopefully it'll be longer term, will remain. In North America and possibly in Europe, where Jews are coming into their Zionism more. So I'm interested in asking you to talk to this. Are we seeing, particularly among young Jews, a resurgence of Zionist commitment, and perhaps in other populations, other age groups as well? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Perfect. First of all, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here at this hour, in this evening, for this important conversation in what has become my Friday night actual salvation from the weeks that I returned from trips abroad for Kabbalat Shabbat. And I'm very grateful to the Asanya, to Rabbi Atlas, to the other rabbis that were here, to Rabbi Cardozo, who's my humbling figure in the room tonight. I was sharing with him that every time I give a talk and I look out into the audience and there's someone there that I say, I can't believe that that person has come to hear me. It's a very, very important, humbling reminder. So I'm very grateful for your presence here as well. And to everybody who I know organized behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, what I know goes into evenings like this. I want to share and maybe backtrack a little bit to what I think we have to remember that happened on 10/7, not just the atrocities and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that were perpetrated on 10/7, but in the anti-Semitism that fueled those atrocities, and in the very same anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to those atrocities. That are silent, women's organizations, we believe you unless you're a Jew, children's organizations, we have captives till 152 days in, that justified the attack. The Secretary General of the UN that told us all that 10/7 didn't happen in a vacuum, that were exhilarated by the attack. A Cornell professor, so speaking, but Judith Butler just yesterday explaining that what we saw on 10/7, Judith Butler, I literally read her when I was in law school, explaining that what we saw on 10/7 was not an act of terror, and it was not actually an act of anti-Semitism, but rather armed resistance. So understanding that a feminist that wrote the body of literature of feminism that we were, many of us, privy to reading when we were in university, is explaining the rape of women so badly that their legs couldn't be straightened for their burial, explaining that as armed resistance. We have to be very clear on that. And most troublingly, I'll say, and actually that makes the point most compellingly, the attack of Jews around the world. In Montreal just yesterday, a shul in which Jews are praying and told that they have colonized every country to which they have come. In the streets of New York City, in Berlin, on the University of the George Washington Library, with the Hamas Charter literally projected on the wall library 10 days after 10/7 that says, "From the river to the sea and glory to our martyrs." The reason that I'm sharing all that and backtracking is to say that it is that strain of anti-Semitism, the virulent, lethal strain of anti-Semitism that we have seen, and you referred to the late Rabbi Sachs and his comparison of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred that has existed for as long as Jews have, that has actually survived by mutating. So anti-Semitism didn't die in Holocaust or in Auschwitz, it just mutated. And what has presented, for all that are paying attention to see, is that its modern, mainstream, lethal strain is anti-Zionism, or the negation of Israel's very right to exist. When students are chanting, when I come to Stanford to speak, we don't want no Jew state or two state, you can have your pick. We want all of 48. They're actually telling us very clearly what it was that 10/7 represented. But that was for many years confusing us, maybe in the conceptia that the previous panel was discussed. I want to actually suggest that a much deeper conceptia or paradigm collapsed on 10/7. And that is, I think, maybe the silver lining that some of the rabbis will challenge us each to lean in and take an active role in. And that is, what is the Jewish story and where does the state of Israel fit into the Jewish story? Because we are Am HaSefer, but in many ways we have lost our sipur. Am HaSefer, the people of the book, without remembering what our story is lost. And 10/7, if there was any divine providence in that understanding, on Simchat Torah, on the day that we celebrate the book that kept us for thousands of years when we had nothing, we were stateless, we had no army, we had no sovereignty, we had a book. And as we have this evening, Leilui Nishmat, so many in our community, and so many cholim, when I think of Arya Ziering the night before, coming into our shul with a talit over his head, and as one of our big kids in Netivot, my other shul, saying to our kids, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, so that we take responsibility, this generation of heroes, for understanding what we are celebrating on Simchat Torah. And knowing that the very next day, Aryeh was one of the first to run into battle without asking any questions and was killed shortly thereafter on 10/7. The understanding that it is that book that kept us alive, that is the story, and that we have lost the plot, even as in this miraculous moment, the Jewish people, I'm going to say this sentence, and in this room, it's not going to maybe sound any bells, but I can tell you that when I say this sentence, a prototypical Indigenous people, when I say that to a group of Canadian or Australian students, they say, you can't say that. And I say, I am a member of a prototypical Indigenous people that speak the same language, Hebrew, and read the same book, Bible, and traverse the same land, Israel, and practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. Now, that may sound like nothing to us, but in the understanding of what has attacked Israel's very existence with the return of that prototypical Indigenous people, after thousands of years of exile and persecution enabled by our statelessness, by the way, committed to equality, that is the full Declaration of Independence, that even as we remember 10/6 and a tank stolen from Teresaki with the Declaration of Independence in the name of this, whatever it is, contesting our current state of affairs, that Declaration of Independence, Ben-Gurion understood fully well when he came to Lord Peel with a Tanakh, why we actually had to return right here and what Zionism means. And that Zionism, 140-plus-year-old progressive national liberation movement, wasn't a political statement. It was anchored in our identity that for thousands of years yearned and longed and prayed to return to Zion. And here we are at this moment where once again, it is actually this new strain of Jew hatred, call it anti-Zionism, the negation of Israel's very right to exist, that's reminding us precisely what it is that draws us together in that covenant of fate. But I will argue, and I do, that 2024 is not 1944, and to continue the very important understanding that as a people, I'm going to say a very difficult sentence, we have never had it so good when we have it so bad. We have a nation state. We have sovereignty. We have a defense force. And just a little more than half of us live here in this 75-year young miracle. Imperfect, 75 years young. And we have another just less than half of our people living maybe a little less comfortable than yesterday because the masks have been sort of removed, but in relative safety and security, primarily in North America, where there is this tremendous, important moment, existential moment, not just for the state of Israel on the front lines of what was a barbaric attack on 10/7, and not just on Jews around the world that are attacked in the wake of that barbaric attack by a genocidal terror organization, but one proxy of a murderous Islamic regime in Iran actually openly declaring its intent to annihilate the state of Israel. What we have is actually an attack on our shared civilization, on democracy and on its foundations, on life and liberty. And so what we have at this moment is this very Purim-esque moment that actually gets me on every single plane I go on. When we understand that the last time that in ancient Persia there was an attempted genocide of the Jewish people, not only did Esther say to Mordechai, gather all the Jews, knos et Yehudim, not only is unity or beyachad critical, but also the second part, אם חרש תחרישי בעת הזו, רווח והצלה יעמוד היהודים ממקום אחר, ואת ותביא תאבדו. ומי יודע אם לא לעת הזו הגעת למלכות? ומי יודע אם לא לעת הזו, every one of us is precisely where we are. And that is that call to action that I think the reclamation of Zionism, the reclamation of the Jewish story, the reclamation of indigeneity and the return to this miraculous ancestral homeland, half of us here and half of us in the rest of the world, with a very important role, that other half of the rest of the world. I do hope people make Aliyah, but that isn't the goal of the reason that I speak around the world. What I hope to do is actually awaken them as this call to action, not only to reclaim their part in the Jewish story, and I'll say our shared part in the shared Jewish story, with 15 million of us now dispersed in this way, and the understanding that we can't lose the plot. We cannot lose the story that enables our greatest enemies to say, in the division of the world between oppressed and oppressor, you are the white colonialist oppressor. No, literally, how did I get cast in that role? First of all, my Saba, one of 850,000 Jews ethnically cleansed from Arab lands in Iran, in my case, Iraq, was certainly not white. But even if I were to accept that division of the world, which democracy is going to have to contend with, by the way, and American university spaces have to contend with, I do not allow anybody else to dictate my identity, my story, in an age where, when I do meet students, that they're very accustomed to speaking about is identity. It is an age where everybody gets to self-define their identity. That's fine. So do I. As a Zionist Jew, and I am a Zionist, and I cannot just shed my Zionist pound of flesh. And this is a moment of tremendous, and I actually appreciated Rabbi Lapin's very important insight of the imperative to transcend and reach across differences, real or perceived, of denomination, of politics, of geography. For us as a Jewish people to understand that we are one side of the same coin, and the reclamation of the story has to happen with us together, knos et Yehudim, kulam, and the understanding that im charesh t'chareshi means that people have the ability and responsibility to speak up on the university campus, in their town, White House National Strategy for Combating Anti-Semitism, whoever it is, in whatever capacity, in the workplace, to ensure that that story is retold, and the reclamation of Zionism is a big part of that.
Wow, thank you, Michal. I was recently in the States and for a family bar mitzvah, And I have to say, everything you're saying really resonates. You know, it's certainly, of course, as you said, everyone is welcome to make Aliyah, but not everyone can. And when I was there, I really felt this incredible solidarity and connection with my brother's community there. And we're very interconnected. You know, if they're not here, they have a child here, or a grandchild here, or a sibling here, and I think we're, in a way, one of the interesting results of this is we're being forced by this to sort of reconnect those bonds, to strengthen those bonds between Chutz and those of us living in Israel. Speaking of speaking out and reaching out to new allies and building relationships, I think we've this war has brought out some new Hasbara celebrities. They were already celebrities, but some of them have become Hasbara celebrities. Just this past Shabbat in Makar Rishon, anyone who's flown El Al and knows the famous mentalist Lior Suchard, there was an article about how he's lost, I believe, 20,000 followers on his social media for the fact that he's going around now standing for Israel. And we've also discovered some surprising allies, both Jewish and not Jewish, inside Israel and outside Israel. I recently heard you say, to quote, just like any group or minority that is the subject of hatred, bigotry, or racism, Jews and their nation state, Israel, will not be able to combat this alone. So who do you see as our current and potential allies, and what should we be doing to be reaching out and strengthening those relationships?
Yeah, so it's so important because actually when I say that we're at this, you know, existential historic intersection that may begin with Israel on the front lines and the Jewish people alongside Israel on the front lines, actually what is very clear to me, and actually I say to every university president that I meet with, and every American other legislator or lawmaker that I meet with, is this is a trying moment for every space and place in which anti-Semitism in its new mutated mainstream strain of anti-Zionism has taken hold. It's not just a challenge for us and the friends that reach across to and exist that require, spoke about transcending real or perceived differences. They require the understanding that it is very much Western civilization that on 10/7 was attacked. Look, the barbarism and savagery of 10/7 in many ways enables me to say that in the name of progress, in the name of spaces that really thought that it was just the Women's March in Washington where anti-Zionists, you know, sort of spoke up and said you can't be both a feminist and a Zionist. It was just one particular case. Or it was just students when I was on a law school tour before I was in this role. By the way, at NYU, at Yale, at Rutgers, at Columbia, at CUNY, I couldn't even speak about anti-Semitism. I came to talk about anti-Semitism and the use of human rights to combating anti-Semitism because this is a critical piece. It is human rights and the international law infrastructure and institutions. And we understand now UNRWA and the ICJ and the ICC and the UN itself. I mentioned the Secretary General who explained that 10/7 did not happen in a vacuum, but there have been many more instances, which I did talk about at the UN as well, that understanding that co-opting and weaponizing those, I'll call it the international rules-based order that was created post-World War II, written, if you will, in the ashes and the blood of 6 million of our people and many other millions. But the thing about genocide that Raphael Lemkin coined that makes the Orwellian inversion of fact and of law in South Africa charges, and the ICJ discusses the complaint of Israel perpetrating genocide, just the most recent rendition of the co-opting and weaponization of international law. The understanding that when it is weaponized in that way, it compromises not just the Jewish people. It collapses the infrastructure created in order to ensure that never again, and I say this because my father taught me. Never again is a prospective commitment. You cannot prevent the past. Never again is the clear understanding that the entire democratic world has taken upon itself in creating that international law infrastructure and the human rights organizations that we see now. Humanitarian aid, by the way, today Canada announced, after the EU announced yesterday, that it will continue funding UNRWA. UNRWA, we now know, is not just the long arm of terror, it is terror, literally. And if we don't hold to task those democratic countries, what collapses is not just us. And as they say often, we may be the bloody canary in the mine shaft, but the mine shaft will collapse. And not just history repeats itself, because it doesn't repeat itself in the exact same way it rhymes, right? I don't remember who it was that said that. Never again means that we have to know the past, remember the past, right? Late Rabbi Sachs differentiated between memory and history. History is his story, memory is mine. That's the importance of memory, as a whole. The understanding that if we don't remember the past, we cannot identify the challenges of the present in order to never again prevent the recurrence of atrocities. This is an issue for all who actually cherish freedom. And here's the irony where our allies are. Dissidents from across the world. The last time, Rabbi, that I had a very humbling audience was in the Halifax Security Forum in Halifax. We knew there was an important security forum in Halifax, Canada. But there is. And in the audience was none other than Evgenia Kara-Murza, the wife of possibly the second most important opposition leader to Putin right now. Navalny, we know, was murdered by Putin. Well, his wife was in the audience. Masih Alinejad, she's an Iranian dissident, for those of you that may be familiar with her name, now living under, well, sort of protection in New York because the Iranians tried to murder her. And Garry Kasparov. I look at it in the audience and I'm humbled. And then the strangest thing happens at that conference regarding our allies. You realize that it is dissidents that are fighting for freedom, that are looking at seasoned democratic countries and their people that think freedom is free, holding their heads, saying, what is wrong with you? And they're aligned with us. You look at the people of Iran, you understand that the people of Iran are completely aligned with the state of Israel at the moment. I'm not talking about that murderous Islamic regime in Iran that does the very same things that happened on 10/7 to its own people, poisons and rapes and executes. The understanding that we have allies that see this means that we have to renegotiate the entire understanding, including holding democratic countries to account, whether it is Canada or the United States or some of the European countries, that we are holding in sort of conversation with on the threat that this poses for democracy. And it just so happens that anti-Semitism, I was talking before to Fred, anti-Semitism is a uniting factor. Look at that, between the extreme right, the radical left, and the radical Islamists. Keyword being extreme and radical, right? That is a threat to many, many existing and not yet existing allies that we have the responsibility to reach out to. And it's challenging because it means the Jews around the world have to first understand their role in reaching across the aisle, whether it's political or religious. Political is a big one. And you mentioned what the cost is, right? The cost in losing followers, that's minor. So what I say to people, because when I come to speak about anti-Semitism and the responses to me are such virulent anti-Zionism that cross the threshold of NYU Law School. I owed you that story. It says Zionists not welcome. It means that anybody who crosses the threshold, not me, anybody who crosses the threshold is outing themselves as a Zionist. I literally have students saying to me, I decided to come out. Come out, and they say, as a Zionist. That is going to continue to be the first step. But the first step enables to reach out and identify allies, and I call it reclaiming intersectionality. That has been in many ways, and I described Judith Butler, but that really runs across the board. That is not progress. That is nothing but middle-age regress. And there are many people that see that. And maybe they're not in the Ivy League universities or even Ivy League university presidents, all of whom I met, by the way, those university and presidents. The most important thing that wasn't asked when I briefed the education committee the next day after that hearing, I did say this to them. The most important thing that wasn't asked of those presidents is call the genocide of any other movement or campus without violating your code of conduct? Because the answer is no. The answer is no. And that is the key to understanding anti-Semitism, once again, in its mechanism of dehumanization, delegitimization, and double standards. Natan Sharansky's 3Ds that have enabled this strain of anti-Semitism in its form of anti-Zionism. That understanding is key, and it enables to reach across differences and create new allyships that I think are definitely a call to action for all of us.
You mentioned Purim Esther's coming into her own, coming into her own leadership. And I'm listening to your description of these dissidents and almost when you think about where we're here, coming to the end of Adar Aleph, entering Adar Bet, Purim is coming up. And this whole experience feels just in a way, I'm looking at Megillat Esther this year and reading it with new eyes, fresh eyes, and incredible resonance. What feels like a speedy rise of Haman and the Gezerah to Lashmid, Larogu, Labed. Suddenly, it feels all around us. It's almost incomprehensible. There's been a number of articles by intellectuals in America. We mentioned just one before, and also Dara Horn, who famously been writing about anti-Semitism for a few years now, has been chronicling in unbelievable detail some of these, like you described at NYU, some of these incidents. So on Purim, we celebrate every year that we overcame genocide. And when we look at the Megillah, we see Haman as the archetypal anti-Semite, and there's a lot of emphasis in the Megillah on the flip side. If we're thinking about there's all the negativity of Haman and the anti-Semitism, there's also the flip side of Jewish identity, exactly what you're talking about. Mordechai is called HaYehudi. How often do we have a character in Tanakh? HaYehudi, the Jew. And Esther is hiding her identity, but then, as you mentioned, comes into it. How do we think about our story today in light of Megillat Esther? How is it similar and how is it different?
So, obviously the similarities are incredible and actually daunting in many ways. The only thing when I think about it is I remind myself that we've been here before as a people, right? Been here before as a people. And when we were here as a people before, it was, as the late Rabbi Soloveitchik referred to, the covenant of destiny, right? So we were defined by those who hated us as a people. We were reminded of the importance of our unity, of the unity, and of the fact that we have an identity that carries us through thousands of years. The thing is that if I had to differentiate, and I said before, 2024 is not 1944, it is possibly the first time in history that our generation, like, very much feel that sense of history that was described in the previous panel, that we are living at a historic time, because perhaps we are living at the first time in history where the covenant of destiny, not of fate, is the one that we can lean into. I don't think the Jewish people have ever been in the position that we are in at this moment, of understanding that we can opt in, right? Everything that I've just described, again, the understanding that the reclamation of indigeneity, the understanding that the reclamation of Zionist as integral to the identity of Jews, not just something we can shed. It impacts everything. It impacts the way that we interact, certainly with our brothers and sisters across the ocean, but it impacts how we actually conduct ourselves right here. We speak about paradigms that collapsed and about Haredi use, but I would say that the mirror to the imperative of, I don't like to talk about Shivyon. I think that part of the paradigm that collapsed has to have us speak about the partnership, of the great partnership, to quote another title of the late Rabbi Sachs. But more importantly, it is a call to action that is a mirror of that, the Haredim can stop being Haredim if we actually opt into that identity of this being the nation state of the Jewish people to which we returned after millennia of exile persecution, committed to equality. Declaration of Independence. That's all that it is. The understanding that, I think it was Yaakov Chazan, one of the first education ministers, who said to Ben Gurion, "Ratzinu legadel dor shel epikosim v'gidalnu dor shel borim ve'amei aratzot." What does that mean? That means that if we reclaim the understanding, first of all, you can't raise an epicurus, as some of my, I guess in the rendition of today's world, I have friends that say to me, realize you can't raise a tush. Right? Okay. Actually, it means a lot for this community and for communities of Olim, no matter where they came from, the former Soviet Union, Ethiopia, Canada, the United States, France, the understanding that any Jew that opted in to come here understands, of course, that what we are, what our identity is Jew, because eating bamba and beastly, as Israelis have discovered, is not sufficient as an identity to maintain over time. Imagine. Usually Israelis discover that when they're abroad. I'll tell you something anecdotally about Stanford. I mentioned it. At Stanford, there's an amazing community of Israelis that have been there for 25, 30 years, very successful Israelis. Actually, this was incredible to me to see. Now, they're very, very Israeli, very, very secular, and on 10/7, on their kids' campuses, Stanford included, there were tents that began the demonstrations, right? From the river to the sea, of course, Hamas Charter. We don't want no Jew state, we want all of 48. We see you now, white people, that's what they said to me when I came to speak on campus. We see you calling all us brown and black people terrorists, all of that. And the first thing that Israelis understood they had to do after they rolled up their sleeves was not put their heads down. It's quite amazing, actually. A very empowered community of Israelis. And they built what they call the blue and white tent, literally this distance from the demonstration tent. Now, for many, many, I'll call them diaspora Jews, the instinct is actually to put their head down, to take off the mezuzah, to put on a baseball cap, to do all kinds of things mothers say to their kids, don't tell anybody. That's not the response of the Israelis in Palo Alto, thank you. That wasn't the response. Their call to action was for the first time, and they said to me, I've never gone to shul on Rosh Hashanah, but their immediate response was a blue and white tent. By the way, of course, the Jewish mothers, there's food in the blue and white tent, there are books in the blue and white tent. Everybody comes to the blue and white tent, there's food. And then here's a little bit more about what the state of Israel is. It was an incredible, miraculous moment. The point being that in this moment of choosing or opting into this covenant of destiny, it is literally the bells of history that I think we are hearing. And each and every individual has a role to play. When, not just not to obstruct and not just, to ignore, but to actually take an active role. We are living in historic times, and 10/7 was the most awful understanding that internally, too, we're going to have to get our business in order. There were many paradigms that collapsed. I'll say one of them for me, as a former legislator, was that terror can never be appeased. We talk about, how we reach across difference to understand where we create allyship. Well, there are a lot of allies that now understand that terror can never be appeased. Terror can never be appeased means that there are people that are going to have to call on the Canadian government, the American government, the European country's government to say, forget about anything else but a rejuvenated Palestinian Authority. Somebody just said rejuvenated sounds like a rejuvenated Palestinian Authority cannot peddle anti-Semitism. Forget about anything else. It's not about who it is. Cannot peddle anti-Semitism, cannot teach unread textbooks, cannot deny the Holocaust and 10/7 and blame the Jews, not only for perpetrating the Holocaust, just weeks before 10/7, but blame Israelis for perpetrating 10/7. That's insane. Cannot pay to slay Jews with American tax dollars. It is an incredible call to action. And I'm going to say again, half of us here and half of us in the rest of the world, including 6 million boots on the ground in the United States of America, with not only the ability, but the responsibility to lean into our identity, to opt in, and then to take an active role in the And that is, in many, many ways, I think, the most important piece of what I think that this community also represents. Because maybe I'll end this part with this, unless there are any questions and there's time for it. But the understanding that, again, I'm going to quote the late Rabbi Sachs, the understanding that he differentiates between optimism and hope, right? And he says that optimism is the belief that everything will be okay. By the way, as this report comes out on Miron, as we talk about paradigmal collapses, is not a sustainable format for a country to run. It's not. On the other hand, hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to hope. And I remind us, our national anthem, of course, being Hatikva, at this very moment, demanding not only moral clarity, but great courage from each and every individual. And I know that I'm looking at people who are the boots on the ground, who are the connectors across the ocean, wherever it may be, to reach across and give the chizik, including the one we had here tonight, but the chizik that's needed across the ocean for people to not just lose friends on, social media platforms, literally lose friends. People are losing friends since 10/7. People are cutting off relationships, or relationships are being cut off from them. It's hard. And recognizing that they are on the front lines of another war that is raging, unconventional war for public opinion. If we lose unconventional war for public opinion, we will not be able to fight. We see it right now. We will not be able to fight the conventional wars. That's integral to the role that we have in our generation. Again, with very active courage and moral clarity, with tremendous amount of hope. So thank you for providing the opportunity of this.
Just a quick word of thank you. Thank you very much for the conversation. It's very much it's been fascinating. And just thinking, as you were talking, now it may be because what the other and we did so we didn't understand the power when the terrorists educate their children how important a weapon that is, and it is stronger than any other weapon they have. The strongest weapon is those minds that are being poisoned with hatred. And we underestimated education when it comes to educating our own children. How, as you said, Michal, forgetting our book, the connection of who we are, understanding our right to exist here in the country as a people, not having that connection, when we didn't educate our children to that, then it was very difficult for us to stand against our enemies. And the third time we forgot it, we spoke a lot about Hasbara. Hasbara is something very shallow, it's on the surface. What we really need to be talking about is the education of minds in the West to understand the complexity of history, to understand what is going on here, but as a reflection, as you said, because we're the what do you call it? The canary in the mind. And so all the time as you were talking was education going on in my mind. So thank you very, very much for that. And thank you for a fascinating and the fourth time of education. What an education you have just to be so articulated. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I actually want to say one last thing about the word Hasbara. Somebody told me that the Queen used to say, don't complain, don't explain. I want to say that Hasbara is actually, in my view, actually just a manifestation of the fact that we have been seated on the dock of the accused right from the beginning. Hasbara means if you're explaining something, it means intuitively you've done something wrong. Other countries, they just have, public policy, or they have whatever they call their whatever it is that they represent their country by. I don't think in the post 10-7 world, with rising from the dock of the accused, as we saw the state of Israel do in the ICJ, we need to continue referring to what we do as Hezbollah, because we're always going to be reacting, and it's a whack-a-mole world, and in the social media reality, we didn't even talk about that. We're never going to win that way. What we have to do is exactly what you said, Rabbi. The ability to educate and reclaim our story means we're not explaining. We know precisely who we are, and the understanding that the state of Israel has a right to exist precisely as it was founded to be, principles of the Declaration of Independence, is actually a complete, I'm going to say, another paradigmal failure and paradigmal change in the post-10-7 world, including use of the word Hezbollah. Thank you.
Just to say that we have in about 5 to 10 minutes, opening LinkedIn will be here to speak. And so I encourage everyone to have a small refreshment and stay for an incredibly inspiring.
Tom, you got it on me.